Hello, and welcome to Wishful Watchers. We're sorry that the original host of the channel couldn't be here today. However, Preeti and I will be filling in for today's video on world building. So, Preeti, to you, what is world building?
When I think of world building, at least the two main things that kind of show up are you have setting, right? Like, is it that you're using our own world, right? Like, Earth,
Yeah.
our world, what we live in right now, using that context, and then potentially what you're changing is like your characters, your plot, and like some things, whether that's like politically, economically, or things like that. Or are you completely creating a new universe or something like that, right? I mean, if you I guess examples of like things that kind of pull largely from our world are like dystopian novels, right?
Right, it's you assume the first 1900 years are in common with the world, but then things diverge.
Yeah, that's kind of like what I think of when I think of not creating like a completely new universe, but taking from. But then like a completely new universe is something like Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings. I mean, Marvel is like kind of in the middle, right? Where it's a good combination of those where it pulls from this new idea of like what the world is and like things like Asgard being a place or like a real place
Yeah.
in our world, but still holds true to like, World War One, World War Two happened just differently, based off the world.
I think the Marvel movies are really interesting view into a type of world building because there's something that started out very grounded. If you go back to the first Iron Man, even, the Hulk, which came out before Iron Man, those were
But no one
set.
remembers.
Well, yeah, no one remembers Edward Norton. How sad. Those are set ostensibly in the real world, right? There's the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan are going on, right? That's who Tony is selling weapons to. And so
Yeah.
for Iron Man, the world is our world, but only very slightly divergent in that, Howard Stark existed, right? Because you have a semblance of someone like Tony's father existing and advancing tech a little bit. And then you have the slightly more advanced weapons of these missiles that he's selling at the beginning of the movie. And then, things completely get off the rails when he builds the Iron Man suit. But even then, it's still grounded in our world. But then since then, they've retroactively changed a lot of that, right? With like Thor saying,
Yeah.
okay, actually the Asgardians exist, or, if you take Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. to be canon, right? You add all that stuff with the Kree and these ancient aliens and warrior races and secret genetic experiments on ancient humans, and then it looks like the Immortals, if you saw the trailer for that, is going to be a bit all over the place in terms of saying these people weren't actually gods. They were just these superhumans who've been living on Earth for 2,000 years.
Yeah. But I think it's kind of hard. Like, something that I have thought about is, like, which one is actually easier or harder to think of, right? Like, taking from what's already there or creating a whole new universe. Because in some ways, like, creating a whole new universe, you have less barriers. Like, there are still barriers in terms of like you want it to be realistic around certain things, right? You probably want some type of political economic system that makes sense, not something just like pulled out of nothing. But at the same time, it's very freeform because you can be like, oh, there's this land, and just like give it names, give characters random names, create a language maybe, and like create different forms, like not just humans and things like that. Whereas like when you have to conform to what's already here, it might be difficult plot wise, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, it's the always the trade-off between freedom and security, right? If you set something in a slightly modified real world, you get all the implied context of that real world. You can make allusions to events that you can expect your audience has known versus setting in a completely alien world. You have to build up a naturalistic history yourself.
I guess like going back to what is world building, if you were to create a world, right, or a story, what are like the
Yeah.
first few things you might lay out, or what are your things that you think are the most important, or maybe even, well, this question's getting kind of long, but just like discussion points, maybe even what parts of world building in other things you've seen or read, other media, have stood out to you the most as a viewer?
So that sounds like two questions, right? First, for world building, it's where do you start world
Yeah.
building? Do you build from the grand cosmic origins and then try and fit a story into that? Or do you start writing a story first and then see, okay, if I need these rules for this story to be interesting and make sense, what are the consequences to the world at large?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And those are sort of the two obvious options. And then your other question was what, again, about something introducing examples.
Like what, I guess as a viewer, in like media.
Oh, what do you notice?
Yeah, what do you notice most? Or
Right.
do you see like any connecting themes between like what you like in certain media about world building?
Well, I'm going to say I'm probably not qualified to answer the first question because I'm not that much of the creative type in that way myself. So I feel, though, from interviews I've read and seen with creators of things, that the more natural thing tends to be writing stories. It's a cycle. You'll write a story. The story will imply some greater things about the world. You'll have ideas for this whole world, which will ultimately result in rules and circumstances that come back to affect the story. And you can see this actually in a lot of longer running things where throwaway bits in earlier things, and it's actually very gratifying when this happens, when things that are throwaway bits in earlier pieces of media end up being plot relevant later. Sometimes it's intentional foreshadowing, and sometimes it's just natural consequences.
But don't you think in some ways that can also be limiting, where like if you create the smaller story, right, and then expand it, you end up having that problem later where you're trying to like further the plot, but it almost feels like you have to bring in random things or things that don't fit into your original small story, and that can be like a problem for the overall overarching story. I mean, I guess it really depends on the world that's built and how fluid it is too sometimes. Because, at least for me, when I think of something like Lord of the Rings, just because there's so much lore and so many like locations and races and different stories you can pull from, it wouldn't be that difficult for someone to say take that like world and create a new story from it, right? That's different from what's already there.
Every high school D&D campaign.
Exactly. But that's like what I think of when something that's a bit like it's broad, but not so broad that you feel like there are just random rules put in place, but broad enough that you can do a lot with it. I guess that's what I mean. Yeah. And I feel like that type of world building works the best because it's not only like that the writer has space to write more for it or has a lot of fluidity in terms of what they write. It's also that the viewer can also imagine a lot with that. I think that plays into it. I don't know.
Speaking of imagination, this is actually something, an interesting point in world building, how it differs between film and a book. Because we often think of, in books, you get to imagine a lot more, right? Because, you're maybe picturing the characters, picturing how they're acting and interacting with the world. But it's actually a case where a lot of the time, good world building, really well done world building, is more natural in a movie. Because in a movie, some of the most natural world building comes from the visuals and the background details. It's what is the shape of the armor that these people are wearing? What do their coins look like? What do their buildings look like? What's the architecture, right? And so that's something where you can immerse yourself in exactly as much as you care about when you're watching it.
Yeah.
Whereas, reading Lord of the Rings, it's a really well-crafted world. There's a lot of detail. It comes together under pretty consistent rules. Tolkien sometimes really hits you over the head with his descriptions of things, and what it might take him 3 pages to say can be conveyed in one nice sweeping camera shot. Like establishing Rohan, for example. That's a beautiful shot, And just from seeing their flags, their buildings, their clothes, we can tell almost everything we could ever want to know about Rohan. And then it's expanded upon further through the course of the story, of course. But Tolkien takes, chapters and chapters to describe this to us.
Yeah.
When we're actually reading it.
Yeah. I guess that really is like the show don't tell kind of thing that you want from any media, right? I mean, you can't say the same for a book, obviously, because you're not... It has to tell you, and that's the point of the book. But in terms of, like, film, specifically, that's how you would want to adapt a book to a movie. Or you could have a terrible movie, like Avatar: The Last Airbender. The show itself has good world building.
What jumps out to you about Avatar's world building?
It's a couple of things, right? You know that the world takes from our world a bit, right? The interesting part of the world is how the bending is incorporated into what already exists. So, like, how is bending incorporated into daily life? How is it incorporated into their political system? Whatever else is there. And so, like, the conflict here with the Fire Nation conquering the other lands, colonialism,
and everything
imperialism.
Changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
Yeah, colonialism, imperialism, like, all those themes that run through it, but at the same time, just like the humor and just like how they build the characters mainly, I think, in the show. Because at least for Avatar, I know that, well, everyone has a different opinion, but for me, I think it's that season 1 is like what really builds the characters in the show, right? And maybe that's why it's the least worst, not even because it's not bad, right? It's humorous, it's still... Yeah. It's the world building season mainly of the show. That's what I honestly would call it. It's the world building season. It sets up your setting. You get to, like, with Aang, you get to see all these places around the world.
Yeah.
Before you get to the Northern Water Kingdom or whatever, the Northern Water Tribe. It sets up all these places, it sets up character, it sets up motives, right? It sets up why, like, Aang left the Air Temple, why he's on this journey, Katara and Sokka's motives, their relationships, and also Zuko, who later becomes, like, even more important as the story goes. In season 1, he's, like, there, but he doesn't really have as much focus, I think. Season 1, at least.
Yeah, I mean, his role is a bit relegated in season 1 to just being the antagonist.
Yeah. And he gets more character development in season 2. But that season 1 is like, it's needed for season 2 and 3, but you might not want to rewatch it, perhaps. It's just the world has been built for you, and in a way that you don't really need to go back and be, like, refreshed on these things, because they've set it up in a way where, like, season 2 and 3 pull from season 1 without being in your face.
Yeah, it's natural consequences, is what I would say. Things that get popular, I think, get popular because there's something to latch onto.
Yeah.
And so that either it's one of the 3 core things if we're talking about a story in general, right? You have the characters, you have the plot, and you have the world, right? And then there's, medium-specific things like, in books, if you really like the writing, or if in a visual medium you really like the visuals. Like, you can not like the story of a movie but love the visuals. But it's when it's the story that sticks with you, it needs to excel at plot, character, or world building. It needs to excel in at least one of plot, character, and world building, and be at least strong in the other 2. So if we think of something like Harry Potter, the characters start out not, I would say, as blank slates, but a bit more conventional, archetypical. What really grabs you about the first Harry Potter book is, you've heard it a million times, the magic of Hogwarts, and just how much of a real seeming world it is. And it's everyone's fantasy to be told, oh, hey, you're a wizard, Harry. And especially in the movies, some of the most iconic moments of the first movie are arriving at the Wizarding Society in Diagon Alley and just seeing how well realized that is. You know, you can even look at most still frames from that and extract a lot of information about the Wizarding world that makes you say more and more, oh yes, I would like to live there.
I mean,
and then
the way
arriving at Hogwarts on those boats,
I feel like the way
is
they shoot it
magical.
is also almost like you are Harry entering this world, right? There's that excitement of like, this is so new, I'm a wizard, all those things. So that also plays into that in filming choices. I was so happy when I went to Universal, by the way. And I was in Diagon Alley. Yeah, but that was one of my favorite experiences. Just like, that's definitely like Harry Potter, just like the world building, how well it was done. When I actually stepped into Diagon Alley, I was like, damn. I was like, I want to buy a wand here.
When it comes to methods of world building, you know, you've heard of the dreaded exposition dump, you know, and that's the telling and not showing. But one of the easiest ways to get away with an exposition dump and have it feel not as bad is when one of the characters serves as an audience point of view character, like Harry Potter does in the first book, of someone who comes from a world not too dissimilar from our own. So in a lot of, as we were saying earlier, stories that are set in close to the real world, that's someone who's lived mostly in the real world, or even in something like Star Wars, which, you know, you can say it has good or bad world building, but it is a classic and is iconic. Even though Luke is living on an alien planet with 2 suns doing moisture farming or whatever he's doing in the desert, he represents something simple and understandable. You know, we know he's a farmer, we know he's a country boy, and so when he's going and touring the galaxy, he's seeing it for the first time as much as we are. And even though that's in a different context, even though he knew that already existed, you know, it lets Obi-Wan get away with telling us what's going on and being able to give us those details without us going, you know, shut up, old man.
Yeah, I mean, that also makes me think of like Narnia, right?
Yeah.
Where they like enter this world from their normal lives, and you like experience that with them too. You know, everyone wanted to enter Narnia through their wardrobe.
I wanted a wardrobe.
Which I don't think any of us have super large wardrobes anyway to enter. I feel like we've only really spoken about like what we like in world building, but like I guess what are world building tropes that you don't like, or examples of mediums that you didn't like?
You know, if you want to tell us about Divergent, you know, famous Divergent hater Preeti over here.
I'm not a Divergent hater. I just think it had potential and it failed. It's like, okay, I think there are a couple things. I think Divergent's world building pulls from too many things. Or it might not even be that it pulls from too many things. It just pulls from different things and does them worse, which is a problem, right?
So
I think
it's not the
pull...
world that it builds necessarily, but it's how it builds that world in comparison to other things that came out near.
Yeah. And like other, I mean, I also have issues with like character development and stuff. But like the main thing is like in the premise of Divergent, or the universe that's created there, right?
Yeah.
Is that there are 5 different factions. I think it's Abnegation, Amity, Erudite, Candor, and Dauntless. And like and each faction has its personality trait or something, right? That defines it. That specifically, and everyone in that faction is supposed to have that quality. Like that's their main quality, except I guess Abnegation, where actually I'm forgetting if it's only Abnegation, but at a certain age, right, you can switch factions, right? You became a certain age and they test you.
Everyone, right, is at a certain age.
Yeah, that's everyone. Sorry, it's a certain age that like you find out what faction. Generally, like I think like 95% of people end up in the same faction. It's just that like 5% or something or whatever end up in other factions, and then there's something called divergent where you don't fit into like one box, and technically you're supposed to like be part of different factions. But like when I see that,
yeah, it's not good when your main character is unique because they're interesting.
but like the problem here that I find with it, right, is so you have this dystopian. By the time you get to like the second book, third book, you find out that this world or this area is like an experiment by the US government that like went wrong, and they're trying to fix it through this faction system they put into place, right? So that's like the dystopian part of this world.
I mean, before that, you just assume that everyone outside is dead, right? That's what they tell you.
You just assume that like there's nothing else. They're the last living humans. It's still dystopian, but like that plays into it later. And then the other thing is like this faction system, right? Which really makes you think about like, for me, it makes me think of like the houses in like Hogwarts, right? Something like that, where you're trying to like, you want your readers to be like interested in this idea of like certain groups or like connect with a group, you know. The main character Triss is part of Abnegation, and then she goes to Dauntless, and Dauntless is just like so cool because they're brave and courageous, and you want to be Dauntless, maybe. It just like everyone's like, I want to be a Gryffindor, right?
Yeah, everyone wants to be brave. Everyone wants to be the hero.
But the problem here, I think, is that the factions are not defined well, right? The only faction that you really kind of get to know is Dauntless, and you truly don't spend that much time with the other ones. Or you spend time with them a bit later, but it's not enough that people go around and they're like, yeah, I want to be an erudite. I want to be in Candor, you know? Like, it's just so in like a shoe or a box that it's hard to really like relate to the different factions.
Yeah, and
so that's like one problem.
In contrast to Harry Potter, right? In Harry Potter, when they pull out someone from a different house, you know, it's like Cedric Diggory from Hufflepuff or Luna from Ravenclaw, right? When they use someone from not Gryffindor, they're not using them for their one house trait. Like it's almost in-universe stereotyping. When they do it in Divergent, right? When you meet someone from Erudite, they're there because the plot needs a smart person.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess one of the things, like, if we were to pick something specific that we don't like about world building is that act of, like, pulling from other sources but doing worse. Because it's almost a double whammy, right? One, it's bad. Two, it makes you look at the original source and be like, wow. Like, just like it makes it 500 times worse.
Yeah, it's not just bad, but it's bad and it's bad by direct comparison.
Yeah, and so that's really not good for any medium. I mean, do you have you finally thought of any mediums after my whole rant? Oh wow, I see.
I guess since I don't have a direct example of bad world building to pull from, that maybe says something on its own, where I feel like world building might be a bit like music, where to make something truly great, you're going to have good world building, or you're going to have good music. That's the comparison I'm making here. But you can make something really good without having excellent world building or excellent music.
Yeah.
Because especially for movies, which I would say at this point is, you know, the main media I consume, world building's, there's the world building for building a franchise, but within just an individual movie, you're not going to see a movie necessarily for the world building. It's sort of secondary to a lot of the other things. And so it does often take a background to the plot and the characters and is conveyed mostly through visual media, or I guess in the case of bad movies, it'll be through an exposition dump.
I mean, I feel like though I've said most of like what I think about world building and the main points. We could definitely talk more about more specific things, right? Like about mediums in general and like film and stuff, like characters and plots, but I don't think that really plays into world building, at least the discussion we're having about it.
Yep.
Yeah. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe and notify your friends, even though I have no friends. And yeah, thank you.
Bye.